In the 1930s, a new approach emerged towards studying crime. This approach, which has been referred to as social disorganization theory, emphasized that crime may very well be due to structural causes rather than individual traits that were proposed in the work of Cesare Lombroso and similar others. As the United States changed from a small land of stable communities to one dominated by crowded cities, sociologists argued that changes and forces outside the individual influenced criminal behavior. Many criminal justice textbooks attribute Shaw and McKay as being the founders of social disorganization theory. However, as Miller and colleagues point out in their book, Professors Robert Park and Ernest Burgess actually began this movement from the University of Chicago. And Colvin and Agnew also point this out in the introductory section of part 3 of their book. So we will begin our discussion at the beginning by pointing specifically to one aspect of Professor Burgess's work, which is often referred to as concentric zone theory. In this work, Burgess theorized that urban areas grew from their inner core toward outer areas. And if you look at Zone 2, you will notice this is where most of the crime occurs. Burgess refers to this as the zone of transition. And this zone is characterized by neighborhood instability, and it is often where the newcomers live. And if you look at Zone 5, which is known as the commuter zone, you will notice that it is at the outermost edge of the city, and it has the least amount of crime. It is what we would call the suburbs today. Presumably, during the day, everyone will move to the center of the city in the central business district. However, at the end of the workday, the zones 3 through 4 will go home. Whatever people are left during the evening may be placing themselves at a higher risk for being a victim of crime. In many respects, Burgess's theory directed Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay's investigation of juvenile delinquency. These gentlemen were researchers at the Institute for Social Research located in Chicago, and they focused specifically on juvenile delinquency, and they hypothesized higher rates of delinquency, and they suggested these would be found in inner city areas which were characterized by high levels of poverty, rapid population growth, heterogeneity, meaning racial and ethnic heterogeneity, and transiency. What happens is that individuals who can afford higher rents and mortgages move away to neighborhoods in zones 4 and 5, according to Shaw and McKay. And so these individuals will also be more likely to have resources to buy private vehicles and not have to rely on public transportation, which would keep them tied closer to the downtown area. Keep in mind that this theory emerged shortly after the American automobile became popular and was quickly becoming a fixture in many middle-class homes throughout the country. Shaw and McKay tested their hypothesis by examining how measures of crime were distributed in the different zones of the city. And they used crime mapping, which is something that has become very popular in the last 10 years within the discipline of criminology. Of course, it is important to point out that these scholars did not have the advantages of computers, which researchers have today. So they mapped by hand, and they mapped the addresses of each delinquent that had some kind of contact with the CJ system, and they found that rates of crime by area remained similar regardless of the ethnic group that lived there. Thus, it was the characteristics of the area, not the people, that regulated levels of delinquency. In the same study, Shaw and McKay also found out that areas that were the most disadvantaged in relation to economic, social, and cultural values had the highest rates of delinquency. And they also found that in high-rate delinquency areas, competing and conflicting moral values had developed. This could include things such as the code of the streets, where inner city residents frown on cooperating with the police and they value things like toughness and excitement. In the same study, Shaw and McKay also looked at the low rates of delinquency. And they argued that these neighborhoods tended to have constructive leisure activities and more parental supervision. And high delinquency areas, on the other hand, often had many adult criminals, which allowed for youths to come into contact with criminal values and associates. And this in turn facilitates the transmission of criminal values across generations, according to Shaw and McKay. Incidentally, I believe that neither of these gentlemen actually finished their doctorates. They were both, I believe, shy a couple of foreign language requirements. Still, though, they are two of the biggest names in the discipline. You're going to hear about them in virtually any criminological theories course. Whenever one hears about Shaw and McKay, the term neighborhood disorganization almost immediately comes to mind, as it probably should. They define this as the breakdown of social institutions in a community. And when informal controls break down, this fosters criminal behavior because conventional institutions become weak. Also, families become disrupted and schools are often disordered to some degree. As a result, there is a value system which is supportive of crime, and it is nurtured and transmitted across generations. And when you think about it, this may be why policymakers have utilized busing in the past in order to achieve some sense of equality between school districts. While busing is not without its controversy, this would be an attempt to provide some type of equalization for children who come from different walks of life. This is not something, by the way, that we see happening throughout many school districts today. I think it's also important to point out that if Shaw and McKay were with us today, they would more than likely frown on incarceration. In fact, that's probably a huge understatement. They would more than likely believe that mass incarceration policies only make disadvantaged communities worse. Modern-day neighborhood disorganization theorists strongly argue against mass incarceration and instead are concerned with strengthening the informal social controls. As you may have gathered from the readings, neighborhood disorganization is a theory that has fallen in and out of favor throughout the very short history of criminology. In fact, during the 1960s, it was almost completely discounted. Still, it managed to make a strong comeback during the 1980s and 1990s. One of the scholars who helped bring this theory back is named Bob Bursick. As a graduate student, he was in the library, the story goes, and he was looking for a place to smoke a cigarette. And he literally tripped over a pile of papers and looked at them, and they were old data related to neighborhood disorganization. And it piqued his interest. And a few years later, he and a colleague would go on to revitalize neighborhood disorganization theory by publishing an article in the peer-reviewed journal titled Criminology. And this work would influence the work of Robert Sampson and William Julian Wilson. These scholars have an article titled A Theory of Race, Crime, and Urban Inequality, which is in the Colin and Agnew book, and that's what I'm going to discuss now. If you look at the diagram, you will notice that Sampson and Wilson's theory is much like Shaw and McKay's. They essentially argue that structural conditions influence the culture in the community. And Sampson and Wilson also argue that in areas of concentrated poverty, people often live in social isolation and lack contact or interaction with individuals and institutions representing mainstream society. This results in restricted legitimate opportunities and impaired communication. These authors add also a notion of cultural disorganization to the discussion. That's their term. And they posit that individuals in culturally disorganized neighborhoods may come to see crime or violence as a potential choice, which may even be unavoidable in some cases. And they also look at the issue of racial inequality, which is definitely a very important aspect of this theory. About 7 years later, Robert Sampson teamed up with Stephen Rodenbush and Felton Earls to write an article titled Collective Efficacy and Crime. And in this piece, they were interested in both informal social control and social cohesion. The authors used a rather sophisticated multivariate statistical design. Much of it is omitted in the portion of their article which is highlighted in the Colon and Agnew book, but they essentially found that when neighbors mutually trust or support one another, this is a form of collective efficacy, which also helps to curb crime. The authors also make the argument that communities which are low in collective efficacy cannot mobilize as a group to solve problems, and therefore they tend to have high crime rates. On the other hand, Sampson and colleagues contend communities high in collective efficacy can mobilize and thus have lower crime rates. This was a study that was done in Chicago, and Sampson and his co-authors obtained both macro and micro level data, and these very talented scholars found that concentrated disadvantage, which could entail poverty and family disruption, was related to violence in a neighborhood. And they also found that collective efficacy was inversely related to crime. Interestingly, the associations between concentrated disadvantage and residential stability with crime were largely mediated by collective efficacy. Of course, there are limitations to this study, one being that it is confined to the city of Chicago. There's much to ponder as you read through the articles this week, and please do not forget to read the 2010 article by Tewksbury and colleagues, which provides a new take on neighborhood disorganization theory. I think you'll really like it. After rereading all of this material, particularly Shaw and McKay, I think it is worth pointing out that several affluent people are today now moving from the suburbs and closer to Zone 1. They may also be buying homes in Zone 2 and restoring these. Again, this isn't written in the book, but it's just kind of my belief. They might be what you'd call, I guess for lack of a better word, yuppies. And I don't like that word, but, it is what it is. They might be looked at, they might believe that moving into the new zone is fashionable or trendy. And usually these may be younger professionals without children who enjoy having a short commute to work. And there also may be perhaps older professionals whose children have gone off to college, and they may move to zones which are closer to downtown. This trend has not happened in all major cities throughout the U.S., but it is happening, and there are parts of Texas where you can find this. I would be very interested in seeing what Shaw and McKay, as well as other contemporary neighborhood disorganization theorists, would say about this. I think it would be very interesting, and it's really an aspect that hasn't been fully addressed by this theory.